today, neoliberal theoreticians and think tanks, knowledge producers, they have created this idea that there is something like the market out there that does its job as an information processor. We can't understand it, and we just have to let it do its work. Because we can't understand its mysterious workings anyway, so we just have to let it run its course. It makes us accept things like unemployment. And I think it enables right-wing populists to say things like migrants take away our jobs, migrants are the reasons for high housing prices. Because we lack that institutional understanding of markets, of money, of prices, all those processes that we call market processes can be shaped and they're malleable.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, Professor of Human Development, Jakob Feinig. And in a moment, I'm going to be talking to him about how certain money myths fuel right-wing populism and how initiatives to debunk those myths are often met with organised campaigns of what Professor Feinig has dubbed monetary silencing. If you're new to MMT, you might want to check out our first 3 episodes for an introduction, but if you want to dive in here, money is not something that, God willing, will only fall out of the sky after we've ritually sacrificed 1 million unemployed people to the almighty bon vigilantor, the vengeful god of government profligacy, but rather it's a human-made system with a public purpose. In the interview, you'll hear us talk about a view of money called charterism. Regular listeners will know I like to cite Warren Mosler's model of charterism, where he invites his audience to clean the floor of the room they're in return for payment in Warren's business cards. Of course, nobody wants to work for Warren's intrinsically worthless pieces of paper, but then he adds that there's a man with a machine gun at the exit who will only accept these business cards in payment for leaving the room, which then creates a room full of people who now need to sell their labour to Warren to receive a business card. At that point, everybody in the room draws their own pistols and tries to shoot their way out. But when Warren gives this talk in countries where they understand metaphors, he gets to explain that the imaginary man at the door is the tax man. Warren is the central government, voted in on a mandate to deliver a clean floor, and he's using a monetary system to do that. So he chooses a unit of account, just like a state chooses a unit of account. We have the pound here in the UK. Warren's unit of account is his business card. And when he appoints the man at the door with a machine gun, as Warren likes to put it, the tax man turns litter into money. An important insight is that the imposition of the tax at the beginning of the story causes 100% mass unemployment. If Warren imposes a tax on every person in the room, the moment before he spent any of his cards into the economy, at that point, everybody in the room is looking to do something that pays in those business cards, but they can't find it until Warren spends by issuing the cards into the economy. In the real world, if you're looking for work that pays in the state's unit of account, but you can't find it, that's the definition of being unemployed. Now, let's say Warren imposes a tax of 1 card per person and there are 50 people in the room. And then imagine, for some reason, Warren believes he can't spend 50 cards. Maybe he's got a friend at the Department of Business Card Efficiency who's told him spending 50 cards is woke. Or maybe the printing company he uses was instructed back in 1917 by an eccentric owner to impose an arbitrary business card ceiling. But for whatever reason, if Warren demands a tax of 50 cards while having a self-imposed spending constraint of, let's say, 45 business cards, that can only result in unemployment for at least 5 people. But on the upside, the 45 people who did clean the floor can now be easily convinced that they're just superior at navigating a cutthroat job market, and that the 5 people now sitting on their nice clean floor begging for a card to get out of the room are just freeloaders who simply don't want to work. And this resentment can be useful politically. And so, as Professor John T. Harvey puts it, unemployment is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's a situation where the currency issuer, the government, is deliberately not maintaining enough money in the system to employ everybody who wants to work. And this is the framework that governments, through their central banks, actually work with, where there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So instead of unemployment being a problem to be solved, it's actually a target. And a completely made-up natural rate of unemployment is sought out by a central bank committee of 9 unelected soothsayers in an effort to delight market sentimentrics, the expectation fairy. In a functional democracy, monetary design and how it impacts our lives would inform the discourse around poverty, unemployment, war, peace, healthcare, education, climate, energy, and everything else that public money or its absence has an impact on. But under conditions of monetary silencing, power accrues to politicians who have the gift of finding just the right defenseless group to blame their contrived money shortage on. It could be those cosseted pensioners with their utopian desire to not freeze to death in the winter. It could be those unrealistic disabled people with their lofty aspirations of dignity and independence and being included in society. It could be those malnourished kids who should have chosen better parents if they wanted a decent meal. It could be those opportunist refugees who should have chosen a nicer country to be born in if they didn't want to get bombed and have to paddle over here on an inner tube to steal all our jobs. The point is to throw around as much rage and confusion as possible to obscure the simple fact that when the government spends, it can only spend one way, by issuing new money as it spends. It has no choice but to spend this way, and governments that spend this way cannot, by definition, run out of money. If people are suffering and dying because of a shortage of money, we think it's useful to know what's causing that. And it's a government that chooses to maintain an artificial shortage of money and maintain the illusion that they have no choice in that matter. And opposition politicians and media pundits who also choose to uphold these illusions to keep you, the business card user, hungry for those floor cleaning gigs. If you're interested in solutions, in the show notes for this episode, I've linked to our episodes about the MMT job guarantee and to the sign-up form for my co-host Patricia's MMT Activist Network. Also, if you're near London on either of the next 2 weekends, our friend and founder of Modern Money Lab, Professor Stephen Hale, will be running MMT workshops aimed at ending the politics of austerity and the destruction that goes along with it. These seminars are going to be well attended, but there are still a few places left. There are prices to suit every pocket, including free, so check out the link in the show notes, where, as ever, there'll also be a link to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks, as ever, for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley. Unfortunately, Patricia's away for this episode, but she'll be back soon. But in the meantime, I'm delighted to be joined today by Associate Professor of Human Development at State University of New York, a member of the Money on the Left editorial collective, and author of Moral Economies of Money, Jakob Feinig. Thanks for joining me today, Jakob.
Thank you so much for having me, Christian.
It's a pleasure. So, Jakob, you've spent many years researching and writing about the history of money as a system and how people relate to it, culminating in the publication of your fantastic and extensively researched book, Moral Economies of Money. Now, can you tell the listeners what is a moral economy of money?
Okay, so I wrote this book because I was really intrigued by something that is really well documented in the case of the United States, which is how people think about money in a charterist way, in a way that today's MMTers can recognize. And that is not something that is new or that pops up only today, starting in the 90s. It's something that has actually shaped US history and before that British colonial history, and when that part of North America was part of the British Empire. So people were thinking about money in a charterist way, which meant that they saw themselves as money users who were in some kind of intelligible relation with the money issuer. And money was not something that was outside of their control, something they could not understand, but it was something that was as political as any other law, right? So when I say people, that is a limited group of people, right? So we're talking about white male settlers. We're not talking about everyone around them who made their lives possible, right? Women were excluded for most of the period from the franchise and from most kinds of political participation. Of course, indigenous peoples were not just excluded, but also subject to all kinds of violence. So there were multiple forms of exclusion that also characterized these periods. So the people who practiced those moral economies of money, those are not my political heroes, right? I don't agree with them. And I think they're interesting because they show how people relate to money as a political thing, right? And they mobilized that knowledge in different ways. They said, we need to create money for agricultural credit. We need to create money for unemployed people. We need to create... So it was always part of very concrete political projects. And it was very different from today in the sense that they didn't buy it when someone said, but we don't have money for that.
Yeah. And you touched on it right at the very beginning there. You talked about charterism. And in a way, you could say that your book kind of documents the history of charterism.
Right. So I think the way I understand it, and this is not a history of economic doctrine or theory, right? This is the kind of vernacular charterism in the sense of like, how did the people who were enfranchised and could participate in political processes, how did they understand money? And the core of their understanding was money is a relation between money users and the money issuer. There was also this strong element that they knew that money could be driven by taxation, which is, of course, a very strong connection with MMT and academic forms of chartism. And they also knew something else. They also knew that there were different principles that could guide money creation, right? That any decision about who creates money, for what purpose, who gets that money first, right? So those questions of monetary design, which is a term from the legal scholar Christine Desanne, so all those decisions that shape how money enters circulation, who gets to make those really important decisions, all that was also part of that popular form of chartism. So it was not only money is a legal construct, it's driven by taxation. It was also, what are those really important design questions that shape societies, that shape people's position in society, that shape whether or not farmers can make it until the next harvest, that shape whether governance processes adequately address unemployment. So the question of monetary design, even if they didn't have that concept, was always front and center also.
And so these days, if you engage people in a conversation about monetary design, you will be accused of politicizing money a lot of times. And I was thinking in your book, you introduce us to this concept of monetary silencing. What do we mean by that?
Okay, so I love that question. So I think it's, when someone says you're politicizing this, I'm saying, well, it's already political, right?
Exactly, yeah.
There is no neutral monetary design. There is no money creation by corporate banks. It's not neutral. It's just that we tend to not think about it, or most people are not used to thinking about corporate banks as a form of monetary design that has very specific implications for who decides about money creation, who gets it first, under what conditions does it enter circulation, right? So it's always and already and necessarily political. It's not just a quantity. So that would be my first thing. And then the second thing that I would add is, if we come to think of money as something that it's always and already there, and we should think of it as ideally non-political, that pattern of thought, it goes against all those social movements and all those actors that I talk about in the book, because they knew that. And if we don't know it, that's because there were processes of silencing. I call it monetary silencing, which is when you have either institutions that are really hard to understand from the perspective of money users, right? The symbol is the ATM, right? Most people go to the ATM and hope that they can get some cash if they need it, but it's very hard to understand all the balance sheets that are involved, all the different kinds of interlocking forms of money creation that make it so that either I get cash or the ATM says withdrawal not authorized, right? So it's institutional forms, it's forms of knowledge about money that, for instance, the quantity theory is a classical example, right? That we should understand money not as part of a process of design, but it's only the quantity that counts. So we can't really, and we don't have to understand design, right? So there's institutions of money creation, forms of knowledge, and also decades and sometimes even almost centuries of disconnection, of a loss of those charterist forms of knowledge, right? And we're still in a period that is characterized by that, by monetary silencing, where most people don't have an institutionally grounded charterist understanding of money. Most people don't have an intuitive sense of just how malleable money creation could be and actually is. And most people assume that disconnection from that knowledge is just the way it is.
Yeah. It's like money is something that happens to you.
Exactly. That I love that expression. Yeah, it's not something you make or you can participate in making and understand, but it's just something that happens to you, kind of like the weather, right?
Yeah, so it seems like, to coin a phrase, the gold standard of this monetary silencing is the gold standard. The idea is that money's a veil, it's just a neutral arbiter of exchanges, and you get what you deserve in this economy, which is sort of a standard. Most economists are working with that mental model, and most of the public are. And people who like the idea of a gold standard associate it with a time where money was non-political and it had nothing to do with government policy, as we've been saying. But was there ever a monetary Garden of Eden where you've just got free people just spontaneously agreeing on what money should be with no state involvement, no coercion?
Okay, so I'm going to first say maybe 2 words about the gold standard, because I actually think that we can say the gold standard is one form of monetary silencing. And I would add that during the time of the gold standard, it was actually a good target for people who opposed it, right? So the people who were against the gold standard, the greenbackers, farmers' movements of the unemployed, like Coxey's army, they had a target, right? They said, well, gold is not natural money. Gold is not timeless money. And we have this other model of money creation. And we think about money creation in a charterist way. So in a sense, it was almost easier to develop counter arguments in the period that we think of, oh, that's depoliticized money, that's the time of the gold standard. But it was almost easier to do that, right? So that's just like a little bracket or a footnote on the gold standard and politicization of money. So when you say no coercion and spontaneous money, I think that there were always collective processes involved. And I'm not an expert in the long range of monetary history, but all the examples that I've looked at, it was always some kind of governance process that was involved. There was always a governance center. Christine Desan calls it the stakeholder that decides about monetary design, where you have groups of people who try to promote their forms of monetary design and try to get people to buy into it. And one important way of doing that is by getting them to pay taxes, right? Which can involve coercion. But I'm not sure I would always emphasize coercion as the central thing, right? The first federal income tax during the Civil War, when the federal government created that famous currency that's called the greenbacks, those income tax payments, from what I know, they were voluntary, right? So people actually wanted to contribute to the war that was meant to end slavery. So I'm not sure I would see coercion as the only thing. I would see governance processes also as important. Processes of building trust, processes of building a sense of collective purpose, also as part of that process, just in order to avoid seeing violence as the center of society.
You also write that Bitcoin advocates, in their way, advance monetary silence. Can you talk about that?
So I think that typically, because when I say we live in a period of monetary silencing, people sometimes say, well, but there's Bitcoin, there's stable coins, there's this flourishing of new forms of currencies, right? When I say, yes, that might be true, and I think it's also part of monetary silencing, I think it's part of monetary silencing because it does not emphasize the collective character of money, right? It's not part of a deliberation in the sense that MMT or chartism says, well, yes, and this is if we want to accomplish this goal, if we want to abolish unemployment, if we want to move towards a more sustainable economic life, this is what we need to do, and this is how we can mobilize money, to mobilize people and resources. This is how we can think about monetary design, right? So I think chartism and institutional approaches offer that broader vision of how to get things done. And throughout history, people had sometimes very problematic views of how money can be used to get things done, but they were more connected to that dimension of money. Whereas I think Bitcoin is much more in the exchange paradigm, right? It emphasizes that money is about the functions of money. We use it to exchange and to store value, ideally. But those broader questions of how to get things done, how to mobilize people and resources, how to include people, all those things are, I think, absent. And by advancing that exchange-focused model of money, I think it eclipses or it helps push back against chartism.
So at the end of last year, you wrote a fantastic piece for the Economic Democracy Initiative, which I'll link to in our show notes for this episode. In that piece, you explain how right-wing populism is bolstered by a particular view of the market. Can you put that together for us? What is that view? How does it reinforce right-wing politics?
Right. So I think, part of the reason why I wanted to write my book and why I wrote it in the way I did is because I was fascinated by how many people had an institutional understanding of money and, by extension, also of markets and of exchanges, right? They didn't think that there is a thing out there that we call the market that just functions by itself, right? They knew that all those processes that we call market processes can be shaped and they're malleable. Whereas today, I think we're in a situation where neoliberals, in the sense of neoliberal theoreticians and think tanks and well-organized knowledge producers, what Mirovsky and his co-authors call it the neoliberal thought collective, they have created this idea that there is something like the market out there that does its job as an information processor. We can't understand it, and we just have to let it do its work. We don't have to do anything, right? The best we can do is abstain from interfering because we can't understand its mysterious workings anyway. So we just have to let it run its course. So that understanding of the market, I think it's very problematic for all kinds of reasons, because it makes us accept things like unemployment. And it's also problematic because I think it enables right-wing populists to say things like migrants take away our jobs, migrants are the reasons for high housing prices. Because we lack that institutional understanding of markets, of money, of prices, they can get away with making those claims that don't really make sense if we think about economic life in an institutionally grounded way, right? So the piece tries to argue that right-wing populism, it requires those neoliberal forms of thoughts and those neoliberal forms of really ignorance, right? We can't understand it, but the only thing we can understand is that there isn't enough. There aren't enough houses, there aren't enough jobs, so migrants are the problem.
Yes, it's creating rivalry where it doesn't need to exist.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And in your article, so you write that neoliberal forms of organizing public knowledge only require that enough people become insecure about their capacity to ask questions about the markets, and that sowing doubt is a documented aspect of neoliberals' practices, and that those practices are similar to the PR campaigns of, say, tobacco companies and global heating deniers. Tell us more about those campaigns.
Yes, so if it's true what I'm saying, that we are in a period of monetary silencing, and that we're in a period also of the silencing of all kinds of institutional understandings of economic processes, then we lack that collective knowledge to relate to institutions, right? In that situation where we're not used to talking to each other about institutions of money creation, about all the institutions of economic life. In that situation, it's if there are enough people in positions of authority who can create doubt about people's right to ask questions, right? Or when I teach, there's always students preface their questions by saying, this is a stupid question, but, right? Like our questions are stupid because they're already answered, right? We ought to know that there is such a thing as the market out there, that we can't understand it. And we don't even have the right to answer questions, to ask questions and get them answered, because we have to accept those processes, right? Then it's enough to sow doubt about that capacity and the right to ask those questions. And that's the one thing that really undermines, because it really stops critical inquiry and collective knowledge formation before it even starts.
So that's monetary silencing as an intimidation tactic, an intellectually intimidating tactic. But then I would say there's another category of monetary silencing where you have a raging debate, a raging public discussion about central banks, commercial banks, financial sector, taxes, but it's focused narrowly on policy choices rather than the broader questions of monetary design. For instance, over here, at the moment, there's big debates around should the government implement a wealth tax to pay for, quote unquote, pay for the necessary things that the government should be providing. So we've got this raging debate around wealth tax. It's not really touching monetary design at all. And I feel that's having a silencing effect.
I think that's totally true. Yes. I think all or most or at least many debates about economic policy, if they eclipse this all-important question of monetary design, and if they assume they assume that there shouldn't be an institutional understanding of money, a charterist understanding of money, they contribute to that, right? They reinforce that. They make people's questions about money creation more illegitimate. So I think that's absolutely true.
Also in your article, and you touched on him a minute ago, you referred to the economist and historian Philip Mirowski and his work detailing this sort of Russian doll-like nested structure of the neoliberal project with inner layers and outer layers. Could you talk about that?
Yes. So Mirowski and his collaborators, they have written a number of books and articles about what they call the neoliberal thought collective, right? So they say that neoliberalism isn't just like a period. It's what happened ever since the 1970s, or it's a specifiable political project, and it is something that a number of people, mostly scholars, have developed a range of ideas, and they have created institutions to propagate those ideas. So it's not a conspiracy theory, because it's quite open and it's really well documented, right? At the center of the neoliberal universe and the neoliberal process of knowledge creation, you have associations like the Mount Tolerance Society, and they kind of like set the course for that movement and inform other think tanks and institutions that are set up to reach the broader public and can create forms of knowledge that we then come to think they're just there, right? Like the assumption about the market as process that is just out there that we cannot understand, right? That is a huge assumption. And it's a departure from previous forms of public knowledge. And it's a product of a historical process that we can actually understand, and that is really now, thanks to the amazing work of those historians and sociologists, it's really well documented, right? So it's really worth looking up The Road to Mount Tolerance, which is edited by Mirowski and Pleve. There's also newer work on neoliberalism by Quinn Slobodian and Melinda Cooper and a range of other authors. So I think it's really important to look at neoliberalism not as something that just falls from the sky, not as something that can be reduced to class interest or that is only a period of history we live in, but it's an actual political project that has its contours and that has its logic. But only if we understand it can we really think about how to develop an effective counter-argument, and can we really understand what we're up against. It's not this larger-than-life thing that is almost like capitalism itself, right? It's a logic of creating public knowledge that then shapes how we can think about possibilities for public life, including for unemployment, for tackling climate change, for reorganizing society in more inclusive ways, right? So it's not a fully formed thing, but it's something that we, I think, should spend some time on understanding really what it is to then better develop alternatives.
That's the great thing about your book as well, because you talk a lot about the period before this PR campaign that we're going to call the neoliberal project got going, and how the public were involved in monetary design and conversations about monetary design. And in a relatively short period of time, this PR campaign has convinced people that there's this, like you say, this knowledge out there that's just like the air we breathe. It's common sense, and that they've been incredibly effective given the amount of time they've been doing it.
Yes. So I'm going to add something to what you said about the short time, because one of the things, and then maybe the surprising things, is that At the beginning, when they started off in the 1920s and 1930s, it took them a long time to get going, and it took them a long time to make their ideas stick. Okay, so they were with their backs against the wall, and they thought they were losing. Okay, which is also something to remember. So they developed that project of creating the idea that there's a self-regulating, all-important market that we can't understand, because they were worried about things like massive amounts of public housing in Vienna in the 1920s, right? They didn't want that. And it was very popular. And they said, well, in order to undermine that, we have to really make a concerted effort. We're probably going to lose, but we'll give it our best shot. So it did take them a long time. And they did it anyway. And they kind of won.
So in terms of pushing back against monetary silencing, you've written about the need for Freirean campaigns to develop public knowledge about economics. Tell us about the educator Paulo Freire and how his work relates to what we're talking about today.
So Paulo Freire is usually known as an educator and as someone who animated, created some of the most and maybe the most important alphabetization campaigns in Latin America, but also in Africa, where, the campaigns that he led taught, I think, thousands and thousands of people in very short amounts of time to read and write. So usually he's known as that, but he's not only that. I think he also has a political theory of knowledge. He has a political theory of empowering knowledge and disempowering knowledge. And when I talk about monetary silencing, I developed that concept based on his work, because he says silence, and when people think they don't have the right to know or even try to understand or talk about something, not because they're directly coerced, but because they have somehow internalized the idea that they don't have the right to do so, for him, that is the central political question. If we have silence about something that's really important, then there has to be something there. And I think that's where I started off with the idea of monetary silencing. So that was my starting point, right? Like, how is it possible that we don't have a language about this? And he developed that way of thinking about empowerment and disempowerment in a very different context in Brazil in the 60s, when he lived with and worked with landless populations who were in deep poverty. And when he talked to them and working for other people on very large estates for very wealthy people, and when he talked to them from his political educator perspective, the most striking thing for him was that people didn't think they had the right or the words or the capacity to speak about their situation and to articulate their relation with the landowner. So for him, literacy campaigns were not really just about how to learn how to write meaningless sentences, but it was about being able to describe and articulate the actual relations and the actual processes in which people live. And that's how he developed his theory of, he calls it conscientization, which is a process of collective inquiry led by some, not spontaneous, not in this neoliberal sense that it's just knowledge just pops up spontaneously just because, but guided and animated by people like him who were political educators. And yeah, the goal was to help people understand those relations and processes they were part of. And I think today, for us, money and also prices are very similar to land ownership back then, in the sense that it's also something that shapes our lives. Where does money come from? How do I get it? Why do I not get enough of it? Why does my neighbor not get enough of it? Who sets prices? Those are also questions that shape our everyday lives and that are very often existential questions, but they're also questions we think we may not have a right to really address.
Yes, even to countenance the idea that the market is populated with price setters, and actually it's probably more often the case than the exception that there are price setters determining price, and the economics textbooks haven't quite changed yet. Their base case is perfect competition, and then they sort of add in oligopoly later on as an afterthought. We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in.
I really wanted to pull this quote, Freire quote from your article, quote, "Any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. The means used are not important. To alienate human beings from their own decision-making is to change them into objects." I think that's such a great quote.
Yes, and when you said earlier that money is what happens to us, I think that really encapsulates what Freire meant by that quote. Because if we think that those all-important processes or those all-important institutions, we intuit that they're made by someone, but we don't have the right to ask and think about them also, then that does something to people on a really deep level, I think. And Freire doesn't mince his words. He says it turns people into objects, right? If you see yourself as outside of the really important questions, then you become an object of someone else. Then you become an object of existing arrangements which have been set up by someone else. That doesn't mean that I think everyone can always understand everything that's about all the important governance institutions. I don't think that's possible. But neither is it necessary or desirable to have a situation where that is blocked at the outset, where there's this rigid separation which creates this object-like status of people.
In the context of pushing back against monetary silencing and stop asking questions, you write about how Isabella Weber's work on price formation has been important. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important because she does a range of things in her work. One of them is she dares to challenge the core assumption of neoliberals that there's a thing like the market out there that does its job and we can't really understand it. And we have to accept whatever prices we're being asked to pay. So she goes really straight at that core assumption, and she does it in a really grounded and historically specific way by looking at the case of China and how they, in the second half of the 20th century, developed all kinds of ways of shaping prices in ways that enable them to produce the things that they think they need most and also making them affordable to people, right? And her work, the other thing that it does really importantly is it asks exactly the question, prices don't fall from the sky, someone makes them in a given institutional context. And it's possible for people to understand that institutional context, and it's possible to do something about it. So I think the policy work that she does is very important, advising policymakers and creating a new framework for that. So that's one angle. And the other angle is also she really undermines neoliberal assumptions about what people can know.
Yeah, I love the way you put it in the article. You're right that Weber began a public controversy at the exact point where neoliberals want debates to come to a halt. She asked who sets prices. And I like that you round that section off by saying when prices become more knowable, people no longer have to accept them as the market oracle's everyday manifestation. So in other words, these prices aren't something that are happening to you. They're not the weather.
It's not something that happens to you. Yeah.
And you write about how this public conversation that she's kicking off here about prices and price formation can become nails in neoliberalism's coffin. I like that imagery. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so I think, once that is open, once people get used to thinking about institutions and about price formation as an open-ended and always a necessarily political process, then the neoliberal assumptions kind of start to fall apart. because it's not the only nail and we need a few more nails, I think, to really close that coffin and to close it shut. But once people start to ask those questions and they become more used to asking them and they become confident in that, then all kinds of other questions also become plausible.
So let's talk about those other nails in the coffin. In your book, for instance, you dig into the history of the American Civil War and the greenback. And in a way, I was reading that and I was thinking that there are parts of this history that are relevant to monetary activists today.
Yes. So I think the most basic point maybe is that it really is possible what I think monetary activists intuit. It is possible to create an institutional understanding of money. We know that because it has already happened. Okay. So I think that's the most basic point. So it's the most basic message. And then it's also something that usually, so far, it has always happened when institutions were more intelligible. So that is the one thing that I think we're probably up against today. So whenever there was a big social movements like the Greenbackers after the Civil War or the 18th century movements that culminated in opposition to the British Empire. So whenever we have that, we had institutions that were a little bit more intelligible, like the Treasury prints money, issues it to pay soldiers and suppliers for the Civil War, and then accepts it in payment of taxes. So that was a really fairly easily intelligible arrangement. That's not the situation in which we are right now, because we have really complex how the Treasury relates to the central bank and the role played by corporate banks. I mean, those are relations and institutions that are not that easy to understand. So I think that's the main thing we're up against. So my thing is, on the one hand, it's possible because it has been done. On the other hand, it's also hard, especially today.
I think what you're saying there is we're up against this seemingly very complex financial system with derivatives and swaps and things like that. And in a way, that's why I like the way Warren Mosler goes about teaching chartism with his business card analogy. You know the one I'm talking about, I'm sure.
Totally, yeah.
The guy with the machine gun, because you can then sort of layer things on top of that. You can then introduce other things, but at the root of it, he's saying, look, the currency is issued into existence. I can issue as many of these business cards as I need to get the job done. Why did I do it? And this gets back to your idea about coercion, that it shouldn't be centered. But I think in some of his appearances at conferences, he'll be asked, look, why did I do this? Why did I impose a tax on the room and then put this man with a machine gun on the door to turn my otherwise worthless pieces of paper into money that you're going to use and that you need to get to pay the tax? And he says, well, it's because I've been ideally elected to office on a platform of I will clean the floor. So it's a question of, yes, that whole picture, when you start off, it looks coercive, but it's kind of like when you apply that anarchist principle of coercion isn't self-justifying, well, then you're going on to say, well, you did ask me to do this. You did ask me to get the floor clean. And this is, I am carrying out the public's will using a monetary system. I think it's a great way of uncomplicating all that stuff.
I think those simplified stories, they do have a role to play today. And yes, I think that's totally true. Yeah.
And so just to inject a bit more of the MMT and to bring it into the nails in the coffin thing, you also write about how public conversations about the job guarantee can challenge and disrupt neoliberal forms of knowledge. Can we talk about that?
Yes, I think that is absolutely true, because this gives us this really exciting option to think about jobs as something that's not scarce, and about unemployment as just something that happens to you.
It's been manufactured by the guy at the door with the gun, right?
I mean, yes, but I wouldn't center that only, because if we have things like moral economies of money, if there's a broader, exactly what you do, the kind of pedagogical effort that you are making, that also changes the relation between the money issuer and the money users. So in the end, maybe the guy with the gun won't be as important, or it won't be the central thing, because if you create a system that works for more people or for most people, where people feel that it is an inclusive and ethically justified way of organizing work and money and prices, maybe the coercion won't be as important anymore. And as a sociologist, I think about governance processes and states not as just the state is the thing that hits you over the head.
Yes.
Which is true also. But it's also a process, it's a pedagogical process. It's a process of including people or not. It's a process of creating employment for people. If you had a charterist understanding of money, maybe the process of paying taxes would also be different. Maybe people would think about taxation in different ways, especially if we're in a situation where, impoverishment has been reduced, right? But I want to go back to your question about unemployment and the job guarantee and how I think that can be a nail in neoliberalism's coffin. So first of all, it's not something that happens to you. You're not an object of the labor market that might spit you out, right? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is it makes visible money creation as a contingent process. It makes visible monetary design as a contingent process, because now money is something that is produced on demand for people who want a job. And it makes visible that jobs are not scarce, but what is actual, and money is not scarce, but what is scarce is what you have to contribute to your local community. What needs to be mobilized are all the things that you can do for others.
Yeah, love that. You also argue that advocates of ideas like the job guarantee should avoid embracing, or at least avoid uncritically embracing, the New Deal. Why is that?
So that's maybe a little shocking to people. And it was also shocking to me when I started reading Roosevelt's speeches and when I started reading more about the New Deal, because it's counterintuitive. So on the one hand, if you live in the US, all the bridges and overpasses and public facilities and things that were created during the New Deal, and institutions that are really central but now under threat, like Social Security. So many people value that, including myself. And from a monetary perspective, and from the perspective of moral economies and monetary silencing, there's also something else going on. So in the 30s, there was still a lot of charterist knowledge in the public sphere. We're talking mass movements. We're talking people who have inherited the knowledge from the 19th century greenbackers and who still, well, if someone tells them you can't understand money, they say, well, but I do. And this is how the Civil War was financed. And I actually do understand this. And if you tell me the gold standard is timeless money, I'm going to tell you the North would have lost the Civil War if we had stuck to a gold standard logic. So people, including people, and importantly, people who were not necessarily economists, had that kind of knowledge. There was also a majority in Congress that was under so much pressure by those popular movements that they were actually willing to issue greenbacks. And by greenbacks, I mean treasury money, to pay for things like a compensation for World War I veterans that was called the bonus. So we're talking about a huge social movement supported by hundreds of thousands of World War I veterans, their families, very visible. There was kind of like an Occupy-style encampment in front of Congress in D.C. So Hoover removed those people by force with tanks and cavalry. Roosevelt didn't do that. He gave in, but without granting the greenback part of their demands. So he maneuvered. He actually put in a veto twice. He gave a very important speech to Congress why the Treasury should not create money. And throughout his speeches, encouraged people to have trust in banks. Right? So you need to trust the monetary system. You need to trust it works. We're going to make it work for you, but you don't have to understand it along charterist lines. And if you do that, that's even dangerous. So he is one example of a very successful monetary silencer, even as he tried to expand in sometimes very problematic and exclusionary ways, but even as he expanded public provisioning and created access very selectively to home mortgages for much broader parts of the population, white working class populations that previously wouldn't have had access to such mortgages. So if you look at the design of the publicly guaranteed mortgages, that is a monetary design that hides its political character. And if you look at David Freund's amazing work, he wrote a book called Colored Properties. If you look at his work, he details how the government orchestrated money creation, a very complex, multi-layered system where white people thought, well, I'm getting this mortgage because I'm eligible, because this is a market process. But actually, it was a very complicated monetary design that was guaranteed by public authorities and designed at a federal level. That created conditions for prosperity for whites, who now no longer had such a pressing interest in charterism and in moral economies of money. And those are the conditions under which, for the first time, I would say, money creation disappears from you for really decades. And ever since then, ever since the New Deal, money creation has not been front and center again in the US.
Yeah, and now I think about it, Stephanie Kelton in The Deficit Myth, in her way, talks about Roosevelt as a monetary silencer, I would say. She writes about, in the chapter, You're Entitled, she talks about it was his effort to protect Social Security that he wanted to frame it as an entitlement, as you've paid in, so you are entitled to take out of it, rather than the charterist view is different to that, isn't it?
Exactly. So that's very important. Yes. So that has silencing effects, right? He said, you're entitled to this because you have paid in for X years. So you are, as someone, you have stored your apples in that room, and we kept them for you, and now you're allowed to take them out.
And Stephanie is saying he thought that would protect Social Security from the next administration.
And he's probably right. I mean, that's one way of protecting it, right? Because if I've put those apples in the storage room, they're mine, and I'm going to fight for them. Right. And it's one form of legitimizing my access or everyone's access to those apples because we have previously put them in there. Right. So it's an effective way of doing it that also has really silencing effects. Right. Because money is not apples. No, money is something that we use to mobilize resources for each other and to organize and coordinate the things that we do for each other. It's not something that we put in a room and we pick it up 30 years later. So on the one hand, it distracts from the fact that we probably need to think really hard about all the infrastructure to take care of aging populations and to take care of the people when they no longer can or want to work. When we don't have to think so hard about the money, right? So it has that effect of distracting us from the real issue at hand. Do we have enough people to take care of aging populations? Do we have the infrastructure? And it makes us laser focused on the wrong thing, right? And that is exactly monetary silencing.
Yeah, we move in exactly the opposite direction to the direction we need to be moving in that, okay, we're going to cut back on all these things that would enhance that infrastructure and make sure that it's there for those retirees so that we've got the money later on to be able to pay for that infrastructure.
Yeah, so it creates scarcity, right? It creates what it's meant to prevent or what it claims to prevent. It creates a scarcity of actual resources, right? Because the more you cut back, the fewer people you will train, the fewer public systems of public provisioning you will set up because, we have to save money, but we're actually not creating the actual environment that we need to take care of people.
Yeah, no. What you need to save is the system. You don't need to save the money.
Exactly. That is exactly true, yeah.
And also, in terms of like pushing back against monetary silencing, you explore the idea that central banks providing accounts for individuals rather than, at the moment, commercial banks have accounts at central banks, not individuals. But you say that if they did provide accounts for individuals, that could be a powerful educational tool.
Yes, so several lawyers have proposed that, and I think I linked to that piece, have proposed that we could and should have Fed accounts, right? Accounts for individuals at the central bank. And that would create this kind of more direct relation between federal institutions of governance and individuals. And it could make it a little bit more intuitive that it's really just an accounting relation between public authorities and money users, right? That public authorities can credit or debit that account. And you can call that tax paying or you can call it whatever you want to, but it's really that process of crediting and debiting.
Yeah, and understanding the currency issuer as a scorekeeper.
Yes, exactly.
So you write about how, in terms of imagining the job guarantee, there have been better real-world experiments than, say, the New Deal to model our vision on.
There are many critiques of the New Deal, including that it's exclusionary character. And one of them is also that, one critique is also that it was not like the job guarantee programs that I read about today, which is it's financed federally, but it's locally administered. Some aspects of New Deal job creation programs were actually like that. But I think that they can be expanded and emphasized more, that municipalities and local organizations, together with job seekers and people who are to be employed, can develop programs and can think about what are the most urgent things that can be done with the skills at hand. So I think that elements of that were already present in the New Deal. And I think it can also be emphasized to really push back against this idea that we have only the choice between neoliberalism or a centralized authoritarian state, right? That is, that how you articulate, how you think about scale, how you think about who makes the money for it, but who makes the decisions about what to do and what not to do, and who should do it. Those can be answered and addressed at different levels. And I think that process of figuring out where those decisions happens and who decides about what needs to be done, I think that is talking about nails in the coffin of neoliberalism. Then we're really in a process of deeper democratization.
And in your book, you remind people that during the COVID crisis, the US government, via the Fed, was offering money to state and local governments to save lives and livelihoods through what they called the Municipal Liquidity Facility. But at the time, there were no major social movements out there pushing these local governments to take the money. So there was very little take up, hardly any, right? So are there any groups or movements that you know of now that are organizing around this issue?
So if you look at the website of Money on the Left, which is a podcast about neo-charterism and the implications of neo-charterism for a whole range of issues and academic disciplines, my friends at Money on the Left have developed what they call a uni proposal, which is money creation by university networks. Because here in the US, we have really large systems like the SUNY system, of which I'm part, the State University of New York, that has dozens of universities that also have, they're like governance institutions, they're anchor institutions, very important in their local economic context. And many people have some kinds of debts to them, right? Including things like tuition, which is very high here, but also other kinds of fees. So what would happen if those institutions thought about issuing money and accepting it in payment of debts that are owed them, right? So just as a thought experiment, what would happen if we contemplated that? Because Starbucks does that too. They also have gift cards, and then it's a very profitable enterprise, right? And they accept them in payment of things that they offer, right? So Starbucks has that gift card system, and many other private institutions also have that as a thought experiment to make money creation more tangible and to explore new possibilities of financing public institutions, especially when they're under threat from other layers of money creation. Maybe as a practical proposal, maybe more as a pedagogical provocation, could go either way. But that's one way of, I think, addressing monetary silencing, by asking those questions.
I'm going to ask you a wide open question now, and feel free to not answer it, given everything we've talked about. But looking to the future, what might a progressive leftist Project 2029 look like?
So I think Project 2029 should be a project that centers inclusion, that centers the institutions that enable inclusion, that can enable inclusion, like the job guarantee, that create forms of public knowledge that disable exclusionary claims like we don't have enough houses, therefore we have to get rid of migrants, we don't have enough jobs. So that kind of like begin to make those claims ridiculous, that don't cave into pressure to become exclusionary, like we see in some left of center movements. We have to become a little bit more like the right to make it, to become more popular, right? I think that's a losing proposition. So center exclusion and the institutions that make it possible. I think that is the core. And then it's also very different from right-wing projects in the sense that right-wing projects don't work with empowering public knowledge. They work with simplistic and exclusionary statements, and they appeal to that and they build on that. And I think that's very different and distinct from creating broader forms of actual institutionally grounded and useful public knowledge.
I think at this point, I should just add for UK people, in the show notes for this episode, I'm going to link to where you can join my co-host Patricia's activist network, which she set up to create the kind of pressure that we feel is necessary around these issues of moral economies of money and monetary silencing. But anyway, thank you so much for your time, Jakob. I want to give you the last word. What would you say to somebody out there who now understands, as you put it, that monetary design is a form of disguised law, a malleable and always political mechanism for authorizing actors to do certain things? What would you say to somebody out there wanted to promote this knowledge and push back against the monetary silencers and bring into being a fair and just moral economy of money?
In my experience, the question of job creation and unemployment is the most useful starting point. Because if you start to ask people, why are there job seekers who can't find jobs? How do we come to think of them as useless or even as a burden? How is that possible that we can think of those fellow humans as people who have nothing to contribute? So that is really a useful starting point. And from there, develop step by step. And I'm sure your listeners have thought about this step by step, move to the question of money creation, right? As something that is necessary to mobilize our skills and capacities and to enable us to do stuff for each other.
That's a great place to leave it. I've been speaking to Professor Jakob Feinig, and I'll link to where you can find Jakob's amazing work, including the article and the book we've just been talking about today, in the show notes for this episode. If you want to take your understanding of MMT, real-world economics, and ecological economics to the next level, Modern Money Lab run online graduate and postgraduate courses taught by the best lecturers in the world in their respective fields. And don't forget, for our UK listeners, Modern Money Lab's Professor Stephen Hale will be teaching 2 workshops in London on the last 2 weekends in June, aimed at ending monetary silencing and countering the narrative that public goods and services like the NHS need to be paid for by the ultra-rich or cut via deadly austerity measures. There are prices to suit every pocket for these seminars, including free, so do check out the link in the show notes. These weekends are being run by Modern Money Lab UK, who will also be running a conference in Bristol on the 12th and 13th of September 2025, entitled Anything We Can Actually Do, We Can Afford. So I'll link to modernmoneylab.org.uk in the show notes, where, as ever, for our Patreon subscribers, there'll be a link to all of our patron-only episodes. Lots of extras there for you to unlock. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Professor Jakob Feinig.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.